Admiral Zextal clicked his mandibles in satisfaction as he watched the orbital bombardment data scroll across his command screen. The third planet of the Sol system burned beneath a rain of plasma charges, its blue oceans reflecting the orange glow of 1,000 fires. Cities that had stood for centuries were now nothing more than smoking craters, and the electromagnetic pulse had silenced every human communication relay within 3 light minutes. "Status report," he demanded, his 4 arms working efficiently across the command console. "Sir, the human military installations have been neutralized. Their fleet was caught completely off guard. Most ships didn't even have time to raise shields before our surprise attack," reported Commander Vith, her insectoid features gleaming under the bridge's harsh lighting. "Casualties are estimated at 200 million humans in the first wave alone." Zextal's compound eyes glittered with cold satisfaction. The humans had been a thorn in the Galactic Empire's side for far too long. When they had first made contact 50 years ago, the Empire had welcomed them with the usual condescension reserved for primitive species. Most new civilizations were grateful to be admitted to the galactic community, eager to trade their resources for advanced technology and protection. But not the humans. They had refused to submit to imperial authority. They had declined the generous offer to become a protectorate world. Worst of all, they had begun expanding into systems the Empire considered its rightful territory. Their colony ships spread like a virus through space, establishing settlements on worlds that had been marked for imperial expansion. The final insult had come 3 months ago when human negotiators had flatly rejected the Empire's ultimatum to withdraw from the Kepler 442 system. The mineral-rich worlds there were too valuable to leave in the hands of these upstart mammals. The Emperor himself had decreed that humanity needed to be taught a lesson about the consequences of defying the Empire. "What about their colonies?" Zextal asked, studying the tactical display that showed Imperial fleets positioned throughout human space. "The simultaneous strikes were perfectly coordinated," Vith replied with evident pride. "New Eden, Proxima Colony, the mining stations in the Tau Ceti system all hit at the same moment. The humans never saw it coming. Their communication networks are down across their entire territory." The Admiral nodded approvingly. The element of surprise had been crucial. Humanity's military, while surprisingly advanced for such a young species, was no match for the combined might of the Imperial Navy. The humans had managed to reverse engineer some impressive technology from their early encounters with other galactic civilizations, but their ships were still decades behind Imperial standards. "Any word from the other strike forces?" he inquired. "Admiral Krell reports complete success at Proxima. The human terraforming station offered minimal resistance. Admiral Thane's forces encountered heavier fighting at the Tau Ceti mining complex, but the outcome was never in doubt. The humans fought unusually hard, but they simply lacked the numbers and technology to make a difference." Zextal paused at that assessment. Throughout the Empire's long history of expansion, most species had the good sense to surrender quickly when faced with overwhelming force. The few that didn't were usually driven by religious fanaticism or primitive honor codes that prioritized death over pragmatic submission. But the reports he'd been receiving suggested something different about human resistance. They weren't throwing their lives away in futile gestures. Instead, they seemed to be fighting with a cold, calculating fury that was distinctly unsettling. Even when facing certain death, human soldiers had continued fighting with a precision and determination that impressed even veteran Imperial officers. "Sir," interrupted Communications Officer Thrax, "we're receiving a transmission from Earth. It appears to be coming from some kind of hardened bunker that survived the initial bombardment." "Put it through," Zextal ordered, curious to hear humanity's surrender. The main screen flickered to life, revealing a human face that the Admiral recognized from intelligence briefings. General Marcus Chen, one of Earth's military leaders, looked directly into the camera with eyes that burned with barely contained rage. His uniform was torn and stained, and a bandage covered a wound on his left temple, but his voice was steady and clear. "This is General Chen of the United Earth Defense Force, broadcasting on all Imperial frequencies," he began, his words carrying across the bridge in the careful, measured tones of someone fighting to control their emotions. "I am addressing Admiral Zextal of the Imperial 7th Fleet, and through him, the entire Galactic Empire." The bridge fell silent. Even the constant hum of machinery seemed to fade as every being focused on the human's words. "3 hours ago, your forces launched an unprovoked attack on Earth and our colonies. You have murdered millions of innocent civilians. You have targeted hospitals, schools, and residential areas with the same ruthlessness you showed our military installations." Chen's voice grew harder with each word. "You believed you were dealing with a primitive species that would collapse at the first sign of resistance." Zextal found himself leaning forward despite his best efforts to appear uninterested. Something in the human's tone was deeply unsettling. "You were wrong," Chen continued, and for the first time, a slight smile played at the corners of his mouth. It was not a pleasant expression. "You see, Admiral, you've made the same mistake that every bully throughout history has made. You confused restraint for weakness. You mistook diplomacy for cowardice. You thought that because we preferred peace, we were incapable of war." The general stood up, and the camera pulled back to reveal that he was standing in what appeared to be a massive underground command center. Dozens of humans moved purposefully in the background, working at computer terminals and communication arrays that clearly hadn't been damaged by the orbital bombardment. "For 50 years, we've tried to find our place in the galactic community through peaceful means. We've offered trade, shared our scientific discoveries, and sought diplomatic solutions to every conflict. We did this not because we had to, but because we chose to. Because we hoped that intelligence and civilization would prove stronger than the law of the jungle that has apparently governed this galaxy for millennia." Chen moved closer to the camera, his face filling the screen. "But you've taught us something today, Admiral. You've taught us that there are some species that only understand one language, some civilizations that respect only force. You've shown us that our hopes for a peaceful coexistence were naive." The general's expression hardened into something that made even Zextal's hardened nerves feel a chill. "So let me be very clear about what happens next. You attacked our home. You murdered our families. You destroyed our cities and killed our children. You thought this would break us, that we would beg for mercy and accept whatever scraps of dignity you chose to leave us." Chen stepped back, and for the first time, Zextal could see the full scope of the command center behind him. It was enormous, clearly built to coordinate military operations on a scale that seemed impossible for a single planet. Hundreds of humans worked at stations that connected them to— what? How extensive was their military infrastructure? Instead, you've awakened something that we've spent centuries trying to put to sleep. You see, Admiral, humans have a very particular relationship with violence. We don't enjoy it the way some species do. We don't see it as glorious or noble. We see it as a tool, one to be used with precision and overwhelming effect when all other options have been exhausted. The general paused, and in that moment of silence, Zextal felt a growing unease that he couldn't quite identify. "You want to know what makes humans different from every other species you've conquered? It's not our technology, though you'll find we've been holding back quite a bit in that regard. It's not our numbers, though there are more of us than your intelligence reports suggest. It's our approach to warfare." Chen's smile returned, but this time it was predatory. Most species fight until they achieve their objectives, or until continued fighting becomes too costly. Humans fight until the enemy can never threaten us again. Most species see war as an extension of politics. We see it as a problem to be solved permanently. You came here expecting to face soldiers. You're going to face something much worse. The transmission quality began to fluctuate, as if something was interfering with the signal. You're going to face humans who are no longer interested in being part of your galactic community. Humans who have been reminded that the universe is not a civilized place, and that civilization is something we'll have to carve out for ourselves. You wanted to teach us about the consequences of defying the Empire. The static increased, but Chen's voice remained clear. Congratulations, Admiral. Class is now in session. The transmission cut to black, leaving the bridge in stunned silence. Zextal stared at the empty screen, his mind racing. There had been something in the human's tone, something in the way he'd spoken, that suggested this wasn't the desperate bluster of a beaten enemy. It sounded like a promise. Sir? Vyth's voice seemed to come from very far away. Your orders? The Admiral realized he'd been holding his breath. He exhaled slowly, trying to shake off the inexplicable sense of dread that had settled over him. Begin Phase 2 of the operation, he ordered, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Secure the remaining human population centers and prepare for occupation duties. But even as he gave the orders, Zextal found himself thinking about the humans' words, about the massive command center that had somehow survived their most concentrated bombardment, about the implications of Chen's statement that their intelligence reports had been wrong about human numbers and technology. Most troubling of all was the humans' demeanor. Zextal had seen the recordings of thousands of conquered species delivering their surrender broadcasts. There was always despair, anger, or resignation, sometimes defiance, but it was usually the empty defiance of the defeated. What he'd seen in General Chen's eyes was something entirely different. It was the cold, calculating gaze of someone who'd just finished planning his enemy's destruction. For the first time since the attack began, Admiral Zextal wondered if the Empire might have made a mistake. A very serious mistake. The tactical display showed Imperial forces in complete control of human space. Every major human installation was either destroyed or occupied. Their military had been shattered in the opening hours of the assault. By every reasonable metric, the war was over. So why did he feel like it was just beginning? In the hours that followed Chen's transmission, reports began filtering in from across human space that painted a confusing picture. The initial assault had been even more successful than projected, with human resistance collapsing faster than anticipated in most sectors. But there were inconsistencies. Survivor counts were lower than expected, not higher. Refugee streams were smaller than demographic models predicted. Most puzzling of all, human military casualties were significantly below projections, despite the completeness of their apparent defeat. It's as if they evacuated most of their population before we arrived, Vyth reported, her mandibles clicking nervously. But our intelligence indicates they had no advance warning of the attack. Zextal studied the data, a growing certainty forming in his mind. The humans had known. Somehow they had known the attack was coming and had prepared accordingly. But how? Imperial communications were quantum encrypted and theoretically impossible to intercept, unless human technology was more advanced than anyone realized. The Admiral was beginning to understand that the Empire's assessment of human capabilities might have been catastrophically wrong. The question now was, how wrong? He was about to find out. The first sign that something was wrong came 18 hours after General Chen's transmission, when Admiral Krell's task force at Proxima Colony went silent. Zextal stood in the Imperial 7th Fleet's war room, studying the holographic display that showed the disposition of forces across human space. Krell's fleet had been assigned the easiest target, a simple terraforming operation with minimal defenses. The fact that they'd stopped reporting was concerning. When was their last transmission? he asked Communications Officer Threx. 14 hours ago, sir. Admiral Krell reported that mop-up operations were proceeding as planned. Since then, nothing. Zexatal's compound eyes narrowed. Equipment failures were possible, but for an entire task force to lose communications simultaneously was virtually unheard of. What about Admiral Thane's forces at Tau Ceti? Last contact was 16 hours ago. They reported heavy resistance at the mining complex, but expected to secure the facility within hours. 2 task forces, both silent. Zextal felt a chill that had nothing to do with the bridge's environmental systems. Sir, interrupted sensor operator Keth, her voice tight with confusion. I'm detecting multiple hyperspace signatures approaching our position. Large ones. The Admiral spun toward the tactical display, expecting to see Imperial reinforcements arriving ahead of schedule. Instead, the hologram showed something that made his blood freeze. Ships. Dozens of them, dropping out of hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system. But these weren't Imperial vessels. The silhouettes were unfamiliar, angular where Imperial ships were curved, aggressive where Imperial design favored elegance. Human ships, breathed Vythe. But that's impossible. We destroyed their fleet. Zextal stared at the display, his mind reeling. Intelligence had been very specific about human naval capabilities. They had 17 major warships, none larger than a heavy cruiser. Their technology was primitive by Imperial standards, their tactics predictable. The ships now appearing on his sensors bore no resemblance to those assessments. They were massive, some approaching the size of Imperial dreadnoughts. Their energy signatures were unlike anything in the Imperial database. How many? He managed to ask. 43. No, wait. More are arriving. Keth's voice rose in pitch as she watched her instruments. 67, 81. Sir, they're still coming. The Admiral felt his certainty crumbling with each new contact. Where had these ships come from? How had human intelligence been so catastrophically wrong? Sir, we're receiving a transmission from the lead vessel. Zextal nodded grimly. Put it through. The main screen flickered to life, revealing a human face he didn't recognize. The woman was young, perhaps 40 by human standards, with short-cropped brown hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. Her uniform was pristine, her expression coldly professional. This is Admiral Sarah Hayes of the Earth Defense Fleet, she announced without preamble. I am addressing the Imperial forces occupying the Sol system. You have exactly 10 minutes to begin withdrawal procedures before we commence combat operations. The bridge fell silent. Zextal stared at the human woman, trying to process what he was hearing. Withdrawal procedures? Was she suggesting that his vastly superior force should retreat from a handful of primitive human vessels? I think there's been some misunderstanding, he replied, fighting to keep the amusement out of his voice. You appear to be outnumbered approximately 3-1. Your technology is inferior to ours. Logic would suggest that surrender, not demands, would be more appropriate. Admiral Hayes smiled, and Zextal was disturbed to realize it reminded him of General Chen's expression. Admiral Zextal, I assume? Our intelligence files have quite a bit to say about you. 47 successful campaigns of conquest, a reputation for efficiency and ruthlessness, the Emperor's favorite tool for dealing with stubborn species. She leaned forward slightly, her blue eyes boring into the camera. Unfortunately for you, our intelligence files also contain detailed specifications for every ship in your fleet. We know your shield frequencies, your weapon ranges, your armor composition, and your tactical preferences. We know how many crew members you carry, how much ammunition you have, and exactly how long your life support systems can operate under combat conditions. Zextal felt his confidence wavering. How could humans possibly have such detailed intelligence on Imperial military systems? More importantly, Hayes continued, we know that you've never faced an enemy that actually wanted to kill you. The Admiral blinked in confusion. What do you mean? Every species you've conquered had something to live for. Colonies to protect, populations to save, cultures to preserve. They fought defensively, trying to minimize casualties while hoping for a negotiated settlement. They pulled back when losses became unacceptable. They surrendered when continued resistance seemed hopeless. Hayes's expression grew colder. "We don't have anything left to lose, Admiral. You already killed our families. You destroyed our cities. You turned our home into a charnel house. The Earth you're orbiting isn't our home anymore, it's our grave, and we're here to make sure it gets some company." Something in her tone made Zextal's skin crawl. "Your 10 minutes are now 8 minutes," she added conversationally. "I suggest you use them wisely." The transmission ended, leaving the Imperial bridge in stunned silence. Zextal stared at the tactical display, his mind racing. The human ships had arranged themselves in a formation he didn't recognize, one that seemed to violate every principle of space combat. Instead of concentrating their firepower, they had spread out across a huge volume of space. Instead of protecting their flanks, they had deliberately exposed them. It was as if they were inviting an attack. "Sir," Vyth said quietly, "perhaps we should consider her offer. We could withdraw to a safe distance and call for reinforcements." The Admiral's mandibles clicked angrily. "Retreat from a primitive species? The Empire doesn't negotiate with terrorists. We'll show these humans what happens when they threaten Imperial forces." He turned to his tactical officer. "All ships, attack formation. Target their command vessel first. Let's end this quickly." The Imperial fleet began to advance, their massive dreadnoughts and battle cruisers accelerating toward the human formation. Zextal watched the tactical display with growing confidence. Whatever tricks the humans thought they had, they were still outnumbered and outgunned. That confidence lasted exactly 3 minutes. The human ships didn't wait for the Imperial fleet to close. Instead, they opened fire at a range that should have been impossible for their weapons to reach. But the energy beams that lanced out from their vessels weren't the primitive plasma cannons intelligence had described. They were coherent particle beams that cut through Imperial shields like they weren't there. The Imperial heavy cruiser Dominance was the first to die. The massive warship simply stopped. One moment it was accelerating toward the enemy, the next it was drifting dead in space, its hull breached in a dozen places, atmosphere streaming from its wounds like blood. "What happened?" Zextal demanded. "Report!" "Sir, their weapons, they're unlike anything in our database. They're not just penetrating our shields, they're disrupting them entirely." The Dominance lost all power in seconds. More beams lanced out from the human fleet, each one finding its target with terrifying precision. Imperial ships began dying with an efficiency that defied belief. These weren't the long, drawn-out engagements typical of space combat. These were surgical strikes that disabled enemy vessels in moments. "Return fire!" Zextal ordered desperately. The Imperial fleet finally came within range and unleashed a devastating barrage at the human ships. Plasma charges and fusion torpedoes streaked through space toward their targets, enough firepower to reduce a planet to rubble, and every single shot missed. The human vessels moved like nothing Zextal had ever seen. They twisted and accelerated with impossible agility, their inertial compensators operating far beyond what their technology should have allowed. It was as if they knew exactly where each shot was going to be before it was fired. "Sir!" the sensor operator called out, his voice cracking with panic. "I'm reading massive hyperspace distortions throughout the system. More ships are arriving." The tactical display updated to show new contacts dropping out of hyperspace at multiple points around the Sol system. But these weren't human ships. They were Imperial vessels, the task forces that had been sent to attack human colonies. Except they weren't arriving under their own power. They were being towed. Admiral Hayes's voice cut through the chaos on the bridge. "Admiral Zextal, are you watching your tactical display? Those are the remains of Admiral Krell's and Admiral Thane's fleets. We thought you might want them back." The screen filled with images that made Zextal's stomach turn. Imperial dreadnoughts drifting powerless, their hulls scarred by weapons fire. Cruisers with their entire forward sections missing. Fighters scattered like debris throughout space. "How?" he whispered. "Did you really think we'd leave our colonies undefended?" Hayes asked. "The installations you attacked were decoys, Admiral. Automated systems designed to look like inhabited settlements. Your successful strikes hit empty buildings and fake industrial complexes. The truth hit Zextal like a physical blow. The humans had known about the attack in advance. They'd evacuated their populations and prepared traps. Meanwhile," Hayes continued, "our real colonies were busy building the ships you're fighting now. We've been preparing for this war for 3 years, Admiral. Ever since our intelligence services confirmed that the Empire would never accept our independence. 3 years. They'd been planning for 3 years while the Empire's diplomats had been conducting meaningless negotiations." "But how did you know?" Zextal asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer. "Because we've been listening to everything you've said for the past decade. Your quantum encryption. We cracked it 8 years ago. Your military communications, your strategic planning sessions, even your private conversations with the Emperor. We've heard it all." The Admiral felt his world collapsing. If human intelligence was that far ahead of Imperial assessments, then everything the Empire thought it knew about this species was wrong. "You see, Admiral, humans have a saying, 'Know your enemy.' We've studied the Empire for 50 years. We know how you think, how you fight, how you conquer. We've watched you destroy dozens of species, and we've learned from their mistakes." The human ships continued their deadly dance, systematically dismantling the Imperial fleet with surgical precision. Zextal watched his command dissolving around him, ships dying one by one as their crews scrambled to escape. "The species you conquered before made one crucial error," Hayes continued, her voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. "They fought to defend what they had. We're not fighting to defend anything, Admiral. We're fighting to make sure this never happens again." A new group of contacts appeared on the tactical display, dropping out of hyperspace near Earth's moon. These ships were different from the others, smaller, sleeker, built for speed rather than firepower. There were hundreds of them. "Reconnaissance reports indicate there are over 4,000 Imperial worlds in the core systems," Hayes said conversationally. "Our new fleet should be able to visit all of them within the next 6 months. We're very much looking forward to having the same conversation with their populations that you've just had with ours." The implication hit Zextal like a thunderbolt. The humans weren't just fighting a defensive war. They were preparing to take the war to the Empire itself. "You wouldn't dare," he breathed. "You're one species against an empire of thousands." "We're thousands," Hayes corrected. "But see, that's where you've made your biggest mistake, Admiral. You assumed that every species you've conquered over the past millennium was happy with Imperial rule. You assumed that the tribute they pay, the resources they provide, the soldiers they contribute to your armies, you assumed it was all given willingly." Admiral Hayes smiled, and this time there was something genuinely terrifying in her expression. "What do you think happens when 4,000 oppressed worlds discover that the supposedly invincible Imperial Navy can be beaten? When they learn that the species they've been forced to call master is just another collection of bullies who've never faced real opposition?" The remaining Imperial ships in Zextal's fleet were falling back in disorder, their formation completely collapsed. The human vessels pursued with relentless efficiency, picking off stragglers like predators culling a herd. "This is Admiral Hayes to all Imperial vessels," the human announced on an open channel. "You have one opportunity to surrender. Drop your shields, power down your weapons, and prepare to be boarded. Any ship that attempts to flee will be destroyed. Any ship that continues to fight will be destroyed." She paused, letting the words sink in. "You came here to teach us a lesson about the cost of defying the Empire. Consider your education complete." Emperor Vaktal IX sat on his crystalline throne, his 6 arms trembling as he read the reports flooding in from across the empire. In his 800 years of rule, he had never seen anything like this. The Galactic Empire, which had dominated this spiral arm for over 2 millennia, was collapsing. It had started 6 months ago with Admiral Zextal's defeat at Sol. The Admiral himself had managed to escape with a handful of ships, bringing news that should have been impossible. Humanity had not only survived the Empire's assault, but had revealed technological capabilities that surpassed Imperial science by decades. But that was just the beginning. The humans had been true to their word. Within weeks of their victory at Sol, human fleets had begun appearing throughout Imperial space, not at random worlds, but at carefully selected targets. They struck at communications hubs, supply depots, and garrison worlds with a precision that spoke of detailed intelligence and meticulous planning. More disturbing than their military success was their message. On every world they attacked, the humans broadcast the same transmission in hundreds of languages, recordings of Imperial military communications discussing the extermination of inferior species, documents detailing the systematic oppression of conquered worlds, evidence of Imperial war crimes spanning centuries. The effect had been immediate and catastrophic. Species that had been subjugated for generations began rising in revolt. Tribute fleets mutinied. Garrison forces found themselves fighting not just human ships, but their own subjects. The careful balance of fear and dependence that had held the Empire together was crumbling. "Your Majesty," ventured Chancellor Krex, his voice barely above a whisper, "perhaps it's time to consider negotiation. The humans have made several attempts to contact us directly." The Emperor's massive head turned toward his advisor, compound eyes blazing with fury. "Negotiate? With primitives who have murdered millions of Imperial citizens? Never." But even as he spoke the words, Vaktal knew the situation was becoming untenable. The latest reports painted a picture of an empire in freefall. 3 core worlds had declared independence in the past week alone. The mighty Third Fleet had defected en masse after their Altarian crew members learned about their homeworld's true history under Imperial rule. "Your Majesty," interrupted Communications Director Thies, "we're receiving a priority transmission from the Imperial Palace on Nexus Prime. It appears to be from the humans." The Emperor's mandibles clicked angrily. "I gave specific orders that no human communications were to be put through to the throne room." "Sir, they're not communicating through our systems. They're broadcasting directly into the palace's main conference chamber. Our security teams can't figure out how they're doing it." Vaktal felt a chill that had nothing to do with the throne room's temperature. If the humans could penetrate the most secure facility in the Empire at will, what else were they capable of? "Put it through," he ordered reluctantly. The massive screen at the front of the throne room flickered to life, revealing a human face that had become disturbingly familiar over the past months. General Marcus Chen looked older than he had during his first broadcast, his hair grayer, his face more lined. But his eyes still burned with the same cold fury that had unsettled Admiral Zextal. "Your Imperial Majesty," Chen began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "We meet at last." "You dare address the Emperor directly?" Chancellor Krex sputtered. "The penalty for such presumption is death?" "Yes," Chen interrupted calmly. "I'm familiar with Imperial law, Chancellor. I've spent the past 6 months studying it very carefully, along with your history, your culture, your military doctrine, and your economic structure." The human's gaze shifted to focus directly on the Emperor. "We need to talk, Your Majesty. Your empire is dying, and you need to decide how you want it to end." Vaktal leaned forward on his throne, his massive form dwarfing the crystalline seat. "My empire has endured for 2,000 years, human. It will survive your terrorist attacks." Chen's expression didn't change. "No, it won't. Would you like to see why? The screen split, showing not just Chen but a holographic display of the galaxy. Imperial territory was marked in red, but vast swaths of that red were now pulsing with different colors: green for active revolts, yellow for systems in communication blackouts, blue for worlds that had declared independence. "This is the current status of your empire," Chen explained clinically. 47% of your core worlds are in open rebellion. 63% of your subject species have either declared independence or joined the liberation coalition we've been organizing. Your military has lost over half its effective strength to defections and battle losses. The Emperor stared at the display, his worst fears confirmed by the stark visual evidence. "But that's not the real problem," Chen continued. "The real problem is that your economy was built on exploitation. You've spent 2 millennia extracting resources and labor from conquered species, while contributing nothing in return. Now that those species are free, your industrial base is collapsing." New data appeared on the display. Production statistics, trade figures, resource flows. The numbers painted a devastating picture of an empire that had become completely dependent on the subjugation of others. Your core worlds can't feed themselves without tribute grain. Your factories can't operate without slave labor. Your military can't function without resources stripped from 100 different species. Chen's voice remained maddeningly calm. "You built an empire of parasites, Your Majesty, and now the host is fighting back." Vaktal's claws extended unconsciously, scraping against the crystalline throne. "What do you want, human?" "Justice," Chen replied without hesitation. "But since that's impossible, we'll settle for prevention." "Prevention? We want to make sure this never happens again. That no species ever again faces what we faced 6 months ago. That no empire ever again grows powerful enough to casually exterminate entire civilizations because they refuse to submit." The display changed again, showing what appeared to be a constitutional document. The text scrolled by too quickly to read in detail, but certain phrases stood out. Galactic Charter of Species Rights, Mutual Defense Compact, Economic Cooperation Treaty. "We're not interested in conquest," Chen explained. "We don't want to rule over other species the way you have. What we want is a galaxy where every civilization has the right to exist without fear of annihilation." Chancellor Krex spoke up, his voice shaking with outrage. "You would destroy an empire that has brought order to chaos, civilization to barbarism." "Stop," Chen interrupted, and something in his tone made every being in the throne room freeze. "Just stop. I've heard this speech before, Chancellor. Every tyrant in history has justified their actions by claiming they brought order and civilization to their victims." The human's eyes blazed with cold fire. "You want to know what your empire really brought to the galaxy? Let me show you." The display filled with images that made even the Emperor recoil in horror. Slave camps on a dozen worlds, mass graves on planets that had resisted imperial rule, entire species reduced to a handful of survivors, eking out existence in hidden colonies. "This is your legacy, Your Majesty. This is the civilization you've spent 2 millennia building. Billions dead, hundreds of species extinct, countless worlds stripped bare to feed your appetite for expansion." Chen leaned forward, his face filling the screen. "So no, we're not going to let you negotiate your way out of this. We're not going to allow the Empire to survive in some reduced form. We're going to make sure that the very concept of Galactic Empire dies with you." The Emperor rose from his throne, his massive form towering over his cowering advisors. "You think you can threaten me in my own palace? I command fleets that could reduce your pathetic species to atoms." "Could have," Chen corrected. "Past tense. Your fleets don't exist anymore." New tactical displays appeared, showing the current disposition of Imperial forces. The numbers were even worse than the Emperor had feared. Less than 30% of the Imperial Navy remained under central command, and most of those ships were trapped in defensive positions around core worlds. Admiral Hayes sends her regards, by the way, Chen added conversationally. Her task force finished pacifying the Andorian sector this morning. The local populations were very grateful to be liberated from Imperial rule. Vaktal sank back onto his throne, the fight going out of him like air from a punctured balloon. What happens now? Now you have a choice, Chen replied. You can go down fighting, in which case we'll hunt down every Imperial ship, occupy every Imperial world, and put every war criminal on trial. The process will take years and cost millions of lives, but the outcome is inevitable. The human paused, allowing the implications to sink in. Or you can surrender unconditionally, cooperate with the transitional government we're establishing, and help us build something better from the ashes of your empire. Your cooperation might convince the War Crimes Tribunal to show leniency when your case comes up. The throne room fell silent except for the soft hum of the palace's life support systems. The Emperor stared at the human face on the screen, seeing in those cold blue eyes the absolute certainty of someone who had already won. How long do I have to decide? Vaktal asked quietly. You don't, Chen replied. The decision was made 6 months ago, when you chose to attack our home. Everything since then has just been working out the details. The human's expression softened slightly, showing something that might have been sympathy. For what it's worth, Your Majesty, I take no pleasure in this. I'm a soldier, not an executioner. If there had been any other way to ensure the safety of humanity and every other species in this galaxy, we would have taken it. Chen stood up, and the camera pulled back to reveal that he was standing in what appeared to be the bridge of a massive warship. Through the viewports behind him, the familiar blue-white disk of Nexus Prime was visible. But you made that choice for us when you decided that genocide was an acceptable response to diplomatic disagreement. You taught us that the only way to be truly safe in this galaxy is to ensure that no one ever again has the power you wielded. The transmission began to fade, but Chen's voice remained clear. Your empire ends today, Emperor Vaktal. But your species doesn't have to end with it. Choose wisely. The screen went black, leaving the throne room in stunned silence. Outside the palace, sirens began to wail as human ships dropped out of hyperspace around Nexus Prime. But Emperor Vaktal barely heard them. He was thinking about a conversation from 6 months ago when Admiral Zextal had assured him that humans were a primitive species that would collapse at the first sign of resistance. He was thinking about the warnings his intelligence advisors had given him about human technological capabilities, warnings he had dismissed as impossible exaggerations. Most of all, he was thinking about General Chen's first transmission when the human had promised that the Empire would learn about the consequences of attacking humanity's home. The lesson was over, and the Galactic Empire had failed the test. 3 hours later, Emperor Vaktal IX formally surrendered, bringing to an end the longest-running imperial dynasty in galactic history. The document he signed was simple, containing only a single substantive paragraph. The Galactic Empire hereby surrenders unconditionally to the coalition of free species and agrees to submit to whatever judgment the galactic community deems appropriate. It was signed in a small conference room aboard a human warship, with representatives from dozens of liberated species looking on. There was no ceremony, no grand speeches, no dramatic gestures. The end of an empire, it turned out, was a remarkably bureaucratic affair. General Chen watched the signing from across the table, his expression unreadable. When it was over, he stood and walked to the viewport, looking out at the stars that now belonged to a free galaxy. Behind him, Emperor Vaktal asked quietly, "What happens to my people now?" Chen turned, and for the first time in months, his expression showed something other than cold determination. "The same thing that happens to every other species," he replied. "You get to choose your own path. You get to build your own civilization. You get to make your own mistakes and celebrate your own successes." He paused, looking directly at the former emperor. "The only thing you don't get to do is choose for anyone else. The age of empires is over." 6 months later, the last Imperial garrison surrendered without a shot being fired. The galaxy was free, and humanity had kept its promise. They had ensured that no species would ever again face the choice between submission and annihilation. It had taken the destruction of an empire to teach that lesson. But as General Chen had said in his first broadcast, class was now in session, and the galaxy had learned.